The air shimmered with heat, rippling above the rocky terrain as the twin suns bore down mercilessly. Zyra staggered forward, her breathing labored, each step sinking slightly into the dust-coated ground. Her cooling suit, a marvel of technology designed for the sub-zero temperatures of her homeworld, was failing. The internal regulators whirred weakly, struggling against the relentless warmth, but the excess heat had already begun to seep into her skin. Her body, built for ice and frost, protested with sluggish movements, a growing weight pressing down on her limbs. She was overheating. Panic curled at the edges of her mind, but she forced herself to focus. Survival was paramount. She had underestimated this world's temperature, assuming the atmospheric composition would sustain her, but the reality was suffocating. The fabric clinging to her body trapped more heat than it expelled, and every second in the oppressive air drained her strength further. She needed to act. A sound, small, deliberate, cut through the heavy silence. Instinct flared, overriding exhaustion. Zyra turned sharply, her heightened senses honing in on the figure moving through the sparse vegetation ahead. It was bipedal, upright, and undoubtedly watching her. A human. She had studied their species, of course, their history, their physiology, their penchant for adaptation. Yet, seeing one in the flesh, moving with an easy, unbothered gait under this unbearable heat, unsettled her. His clothing was loose, breathable, perfect for this climate. His dark hair clung to his forehead, damp with sweat, but he appeared unhindered by the temperature that was actively destroying her. He raised a hand, a slow, non-threatening motion, and spoke. His language was familiar, though the accent was strange to her ears. "You look like you're in trouble." Zyra fought against her own sluggishness. Words formed, slow and deliberate. "Heat too much." His eyes flicked over her form, assessing. There was no immediate hostility, but wariness lined his features. He took a careful step forward. "You're not built for this, are you?" A question with an obvious answer. Still, she forced herself to respond.
"No."
The human, Ethan, as he later introduced himself, watched her for a beat longer before exhaling. "You need to cool off fast." He scanned the area, his expression shifting as if weighing his options. "I have water, but that suit," his gaze lingered on the dark material hugging her frame. "It's making it worse, isn't it?" The admission clawed at her pride, but she nodded. She had always relied on technology, on careful calculations. But she had miscalculated. She needed to adapt, and quickly. With trembling fingers, she released the first set of thermal seals at her collar, peeling back the heavy outer layer. The rush of air against her damp skin sent a shock through her body, relief mixed with exposure. Beneath the outer shell, a lighter underlayer remained, but already, she could feel a difference. A shuddering breath left her lips, and the weakness in her limbs lessened, if only marginally. Ethan said nothing for a moment, then unfastened the canister at his side, stepping closer. "Here." He extended it toward her. "Water." Zyra hesitated. She had encountered the concept of trust before, but here, under these suns, with her body betraying her and her mind fraying at the edges, it felt more tangible than ever. If she refused, she risked collapse. If she accepted, she acknowledged a reliance on this human, an unsettling reality she had not prepared for. The heat pressed against her skull, reminding her there was no real choice. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the canister. His skin was warmer than hers, but sturdy. Human physiology, she thought distantly, was fascinating. She drank cautiously, allowing the liquid to coat her throat before swallowing. The sensation was alien, yet undeniably necessary. A spark of clarity returned to her mind. Ethan observed her carefully. "Better?" She nodded, unwilling to waste energy on words. The relief was fleeting, but enough. A distant rumble cut through the thick air, and Ethan's head snapped toward the horizon. His expression tightened. "We can't stay here. The heat's bad enough, but there are other things to worry about." Zyra lifted her gaze, her senses sharpening despite her weakened state. The landscape stretched out before them. Vast, open and treacherous. Ethan's posture told her he knew something she did not. She had no strength to question it. For now, she would follow. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the shifting wind and the faint hum of distant movement. Zyra steadied herself, the brief relief from the water giving her just enough clarity to recognize the unease in Ethan's stance. His muscles were tense, his gaze fixed beyond the rocky outcrop ahead. He was listening, watching. The realization sent a ripple of awareness through her own senses. Something was wrong. Ethan exhaled sharply. "We need to move. Now." Her limbs still ached from the heat, but she forced herself into motion, following as he set a brisk pace toward the jagged rock formations that lined the horizon. Each step sent small clouds of dust curling around their feet. The landscape stretched wide and empty, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed against Zyra's back. Ethan spoke in a hushed tone as they walked. "This planet has predators. Big ones. They hunt using heat signatures." A pulse of alarm shot through her. She had already drawn too much attention. The exertion, the overheating, she had been radiating like a beacon. Ethan must have seen her expression darken. "We can mask it, but we have to get to cover first." A low, resonant sound rumbled across the land, vibrating through the air like the distant growl of something ancient and patient. Ethan grabbed her wrist, urgency overtaking caution. Zyra did not resist. Her body, still sluggish but improving, kept pace as they wove between towering rock spires. The ground trembled. A sound, like shifting sand and grinding stone, slithered through the dry air. Ethan swore under his breath. "It's close." Zyra glanced back. At first, there was nothing but the distorted haze of heat rising from the ground. Then movement, something massive, blending seamlessly into the terrain. A predator unlike anything she had encountered. Its body rippled, its skin shifting hues to mimic its surroundings. It was nearly invisible, save for the way the air warped around it, betraying the immense heat it emitted. It was tracking them. Ethan pulled her behind a craggy overhang, pressing his back against the stone. Zyra followed, her breath controlled but rapid. He whispered, voice barely audible. "It senses us, but it's waiting." She understood. It was assessing, calculating the moment to strike. The space between them and the next cover was too far. If they ran, it would see. If they stayed, it would eventually close in. Her mind raced, the survival instincts of her species warring with the unfamiliar elements of this world. And then an idea formed. Her hand brushed against Ethan's arm, drawing his attention. "Heat. Mask it." His brow furrowed, then realization flickered in his eyes. His hand went to his belt, pulling free a small metallic device. A thermal regulator, primitive compared to her suit systems, but functional. He adjusted the settings, turning the dial to emit a concentrated burst of artificial heat a few meters away. The device, once activated, hummed softly. The shift in the air was immediate. The predator's attention snapped toward the decoy, its elongated limbs twitching, recalculating. Zyra moved first. Silent, swift. Ethan followed. They darted toward the next set of boulders, staying low. The moment they slid into cover, Ethan killed the decoy's signal, plunging the area back into stillness. The predator hesitated. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it began to shift away, slinking into the vast expanse, its body once again blending seamlessly with the terrain. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Zyra exhaled first, her chest rising and falling in controlled motions. Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair, muttering something about how that had been too close. She turned to him. "You knew about it." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I've seen them before. Lost people to them." He looked at her then, something searching in his gaze. "Didn't think you'd pick up on heat masking so fast." Zyra straightened, regaining some of her composure. "I adapt." A small, tired smile ghosted across his face. "Yeah, you do." The wind shifted again, cooler now, carrying with it the scent of minerals and distant moisture. The worst of the heat was behind them, but the night would bring its own dangers. Ethan glanced at the sky, measuring the light left in the day. We need to find proper shelter before dark. Zyra nodded. The immediate threat had passed, but the planet had made itself clear. It was not a place that forgave mistakes. And neither of them planned on making another one. The cave walls pulsed with a dull, ambient glow, minerals embedded in the stone catching the last light of the fading suns. Zyra pressed a hand against a cool surface, feeling the welcome contrast against her overheated skin. The air inside was crisp, untouched by the relentless heat outside, and for the first time since arriving on this planet, she could breathe without the weight of exhaustion dragging her down. Ethan dropped his pack onto the ground with a heavy sigh, rolling his shoulders as he took stock of their surroundings. This should do for the night. Zyra remained standing, watching the entrance of the cave as the darkness crept in, swallowing the harsh landscape in deepening shadows. The planet was quiet now, but she could sense the life beyond the rocks, waiting. This world did not rest. Ethan noticed her stillness. You should sit. Your body's been through hell today. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto a flat stone, legs folding beneath her. The heat exhaustion had faded into something more manageable, but the weight of the day lingered in her limbs. Ethan pulled a ration pack from his belt, tearing it open with practiced efficiency. You eat, he asked, offering it toward her. Zyra studied the contents, a dense protein bar, shaped and processed in the way of human sustenance. It smelled unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Not like this, she admitted. He gave a short chuckle. Figures. He took a bite himself before leaning back against the cave wall. Weird day, huh? Zyra turned her gaze toward him, observing the lines of weariness etched into his expression. Humans were different from her kind in ways she was only beginning to understand. Their resilience, their ability to adapt to the harshest conditions, their willingness to help even when logic dictated they shouldn't. Ethan had no reason to assist her. No reason to risk his own survival for hers. And yet he had. She found herself speaking before she had fully considered the words. You did not have to help me. Ethan paused mid-chew, then swallowed. Guess not. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying distant sounds, creatures stirring, hidden things moving beneath the cover of night. Zyra's fingers traced the edge of her cooling suit where the damaged regulators had failed her. She had trusted technology, calculations, systems built to protect her, and they had nearly cost her everything. I miscalculated, she admitted. I was not prepared for this place. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Yeah, well, welcome to being human. We do that a lot. She tilted her head. And yet you survive. He shrugged, the motion lazy but weighted. We learn. We adapt. Zyra considered that. Adaptation was a necessity, not a choice. Her people thrived in control, in carefully constructed environments where every variable was accounted for. But here, on this unpredictable, hostile world, there was no perfect calculation. There was only the next decision, the next moment. Ethan set his empty ration pack aside. What about you? She frowned slightly. What about me? He gestured vaguely. Your people. Your world. What's it like? For a moment, she was back among the frost-covered spires of her home, where the air was crisp with the bite of sub-zero winds, where the light reflected off endless ice fields, painting the sky in shimmering colors, where every breath was sharp and alive. Cold, she said simply. Ethan huffed a laugh. Yeah, I got that part. She hesitated, then added, structured, controlled. We do not often leave our designated sectors. Travel is rare. He raised a brow. And yet, here you are. Zyra glanced at him, then at the cavern ceiling where faint traces of bioluminescent fungi pulsed with dim light. I was meant to observe, she admitted, not to engage. Ethan grinned. Well, you kinda screwed that up. Something unexpected flickered in her chest, amusement. She shook her head, exhaling softly. Yes. A comfortable quiet settled between them. The planet continued its slow rotation outside, stars creeping into view beyond the cave's entrance. Ethan stretched out his legs. So, what happens now? You heading back to your people? The question hung in the air. Zyra had assumed that would be the next step. She had gathered enough data, survived the ordeal. Returning to her world would be the logical conclusion. And yet the thought of leaving felt incomplete. She glanced at Ethan, this strange human who had thrown his calculations aside to help her, who had adapted without hesitation, who had taught her something she had not expected to learn. Perhaps observation was not enough. She met his gaze. Not yet. Ethan smirked. Good. It'd be boring here without you. The stars burned overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, something unseen moved. But inside the cave, in the quiet space carved out by survival, Zyra had made her choice. The night was restless. The wind howled through the rocky formations outside, carrying with it the distant sounds of creatures that thrived in the dark. The cave provided shelter, but the world beyond its walls remained untamed, shifting, waiting. Zyra sat near the entrance, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of stars stretching endlessly above. Even here, so far from home, the sky still held a familiar pull. Ethan stirred behind her, his movements quiet but unguarded. He had dozed off for a time, exhaustion claiming him after the long day, but now his presence was felt again, steady and grounding. He stepped forward, dropping onto the stone beside her, his posture relaxed yet alert. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low against the wind. Zyra shook her head. Too much to process. Ethan nodded, as if he understood. Perhaps he did. He had lived on this planet, fought against its merciless nature, survived where others had not. She wondered how many nights he had spent like this, staring at the stars, feeling the weight of existence pressing down without reprieve. He leaned back against the rock, watching her from the corner of his eye. Regretting staying? She considered the question. Logically, her mission had already veered off course. Her survival should have taken priority. Yet, something about this place, about the way Ethan moved through it, imperfect, instinctive, uncalculated, kept her here. There was something to learn, something beyond data and observation. No, she answered at last. Not yet. Ethan smirked, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. Good. You might just get the hang of this whole improvising thing. Zyra exhaled softly, something akin to a laugh. Doubtful. They sat in silence for a while, the cool air pressing against their skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the day. The world had changed in the span of hours, shifting between extremes with little regard for those who inhabited it. Ethan's voice broke the quiet. So, what happens after this? She turned to him, brow slightly furrowed. After what?
This. You. Me.
Surviving, learning, all of it. His tone was casual, but the question held weight. Zyra didn't have an answer. She had spent her life following predetermined paths, bound by rules and expectations. There had always been a plan, a structure. Now, for the first time, there was only the unknown. I don't know, she admitted. The words felt foreign on her tongue. Ethan chuckled. Welcome to my world. The cave shifted with the breeze, a faint whistle threading through the cracks in the stone. Zyra traced the rough texture beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in the present. She thought of home, the frozen landscapes, the rigid hierarchy, the certainty that had once defined her existence. She should have longed for it, but instead, she found herself anchored here, on an unforgiving planet, beside a human who had defied every expectation she held. Ethan stood, stretching his limbs. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out. There was no certainty in his words, no precise calculation, yet there was confidence. A belief that the future would unfold regardless, shaped not by rigid plans, but by the choices they made in each passing moment. For the first time, Zyra considered that there might be more than one way to survive. She rose to her feet, standing beside him, looking out into the night. The world beyond was dark, unpredictable, and full of danger. And yet, she was not afraid. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of deep violet and rusted gold. The air was still, thick with the scent of sun-warmed rock and distant mineral deposits. Zyra stood at the cave's entrance, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of terrain before her. The heat had not yet returned in full force, but she could already feel the slow climb in temperature against her skin. Ethan moved beside her, adjusting the straps of his pack. His movements were fluid, practiced. Every action served a purpose. He had spent enough time in this world to know that even a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Zyra had witnessed it herself. "We move now," he said, voice low but certain. "Before the heat traps us here." Zyra nodded. She had known this moment was coming, the time to step away from shelter, to move forward into the unknown. The planet would not wait for them. Neither would the dangers that lurked beneath its surface. They descended from the rocky outcrop, their steps measured against the uneven terrain. Dust curled in soft plumes around their boots, carried by the subtle shift of the wind. Zyra's body had adjusted to the demands of this world, though the memory of her earlier struggle remained sharp in her mind. Ethan glanced at her, as if assessing. "You holding up?" "Yes." It was not an exaggeration. She felt stronger now, more aware of the rhythms of this place, more in tune with its unpredictability. She was still learning, but she was no longer just surviving. She was adapting. The land stretched before them in an endless expanse of jagged cliffs and dried riverbeds. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the next step in their journey, whatever that would be. Zyra had stopped expecting certainty. Ethan exhaled sharply, adjusting his stance as he surveyed the landscape. "There's an outpost about 3 days from here. Supply caches. Possible shelter." It was a destination, but not an answer. Zyra studied him, searching for the unspoken meaning beneath his words. "And after that?" Ethan's mouth quirked slightly, though there was something unreadable in his expression. "We see where the stars take us." She considered that. The idea of direction without rigid structure, of movement without preordained purpose. It was unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. They moved in silence, their shadows stretching long against the sunlit stone. The planet watched, patient and unyielding. And they walked forward, toward whatever came next. The midday heat bore down on them, turning the ground beneath their feet into a furnace. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, an unbroken expanse of pale gold. Each step felt heavier now, the weight of exhaustion creeping into Zyra's limbs despite her best efforts to push it aside. Ethan walked ahead, his pace steady, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. The outpost was still days away, and the land offered little in the way of respite. Zyra adjusted the cooling mechanism on her suit, though she knew it would provide only temporary relief. The heat here was different, unrelenting, seeping into every exposed surface. She had never experienced anything like it before arriving on this world. Her home had been defined by cold precision, by controlled climates and calculated environments. Here, nature did not bend to the will of logic. It was chaos, unpredictable and untamed. Ethan suddenly raised a hand, signaling for her to stop. She obeyed without hesitation, her body going still as her senses sharpened. The silence around them was thick, unnatural. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on a patch of cracked earth ahead, where the ground sloped downward into a shallow basin. Zyra followed his line of sight, scanning for movement, for any anomaly in the landscape. Then she saw it, a faint shimmer, like heat rising from the sand, but wrong. Too controlled. Too deliberate. A trap, she guessed. Ethan nodded. Could be a sinkhole. Could be something worse. The planet had many ways of killing those who underestimated it. Zyra had learned that lesson firsthand. She took a careful step back, recalculating their path. "We go around?" Ethan glanced at the sky, judging the time. "Yeah, adds a few extra hours, but better than getting swallowed whole." They adjusted course, keeping a wide berth around the shimmering ground. The detour took them through a narrow ravine, where the air was thick with the scent of mineral deposits. Zyra remained alert, every sense attuned to the unfamiliar terrain. The deeper they went, the more the walls of the ravine closed in, the temperature shifting from dry heat to something heavier, almost suffocating. Then she heard it. A low, rhythmic clicking, reverberating off the stone. Ethan heard it too. He shot her a look, his hand moving toward his weapon. Zyra didn't reach for hers.
Not yet.
Instead, she focused, trying to isolate the source of the sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't shifting rock. It was something alive. A shadow moved along the upper ridge of the ravine, barely visible against the sunlit stone. Then another. Zyra's pulse quickened. We're not alone. Ethan's jaw tightened.
Yeah.
Noticed. The clicking grew louder, multiplying. The echoes made it impossible to tell how many were out there, watching, waiting. Zyra's fingers twitched at her side. They had two choices, run or stand their ground. Ethan inhaled sharply. On my signal. The first shape dropped from the ridge, landing in a crouch just meters ahead. A flash of dark, chitinous skin, limbs too long, eyes reflecting the light like polished obsidian. Then another followed. And another. Zyra's muscles coiled, instinct taking hold. Ethan shifted his stance beside her, his fingers tightening around his weapon. The creatures did not attack immediately. They moved with unsettling precision, their bodies low to the ground, their movements fluid and controlled. Intelligent.
A test.
Zyra exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Violence would be the simplest answer, but not necessarily the right one. She took a step forward. Ethan tensed. Zyra. She raised a hand, silencing him. The creatures tracked her movement, their heads tilting in eerie unison. Zyra met their gaze, steady and unyielding. A silent exchange. A challenge. The clicking sound changed, the rhythm shifting. Then, without warning, the creatures turned and vanished back into the rocks as swiftly as they had appeared. Ethan let out a breath. What the hell was that? Zyra watched the empty space where they had stood. A warning. Ethan shook his head.
Great.
Love those. The ravine was silent once more, but the weight of unseen eyes remained. Zyra adjusted her stance, meeting Ethan's gaze. We keep moving. Ethan hesitated, then nodded.
Yeah.
Let's not stick around for round two. They pressed forward, leaving the ravine behind. The planet was watching, waiting, and so was whatever else lurked in its shadows. The sky burned crimson as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged terrain. The air was thick with heat, though the worst of the day's scorch had passed. Zyra kept her pace steady, her body moving in sync with Ethan's beside her. Every muscle ached, exhaustion clawing at the edges of her consciousness, but she forced it down. Stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. The creatures had let them go, for now. But Zyra knew better than to assume safety. This planet had no true sanctuary, only temporary reprieves. The encounter in the ravine had confirmed something she had already suspected. They were being watched, maybe even followed. Ethan had said little since they escaped, his usual sharp remarks replaced by quiet calculation. She could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing in the silence between them. She didn't mind. Words would not change the reality of their situation. The outpost was still 2 days away, assuming no further delays. That assumption felt increasingly fragile. Zyra adjusted the straps of her gear, her body sore beneath the layers of fabric. The temperature had dropped significantly, and soon the cold would set in, a different kind of threat, one just as merciless as the heat. She had learned that the hard way. The balance between survival and failure here was razor-thin. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. We need higher ground before nightfall. She nodded. It was sound logic. A vantage point would give them a chance to spot movement, to prepare. More than that, it would give them distance from whatever still lingered in the shadows behind them. The land sloped upward toward a rocky plateau, the kind of elevation that could provide some measure of security. It would be a climb, but they had no better option. Zyra glanced back once, scanning the landscape behind them. There was nothing but empty, shifting dust. And yet, She could feel it. That same presence, unseen but undeniable. Ethan noticed. You sense it too. She met his gaze. Yes. He sighed, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight. Then let's not make it easy for them. They moved quickly, pushing up the incline before the last of the light faded. Loose rock threatened to slip beneath their boots, but they kept climbing, their breaths controlled, their focus unshaken. By the time they reached the plateau, the first stars had begun to pierce through the darkening sky. Zyra crouched near the edge, scanning the expanse below. The land stretched endlessly, bathed in deep violet shadows, the wind carrying with it the whispers of the unknown. She narrowed her eyes. Movement. Faint, almost imperceptible. Ethan followed her gaze.
Yeah.
We're not imagining things. Zyra exhaled slowly. They're studying us. Ethan dropped his pack, stretching his legs. Figures. I'd be curious too. Zyra didn't share his attempt at levity. The creatures had let them go earlier, but that didn't mean they wouldn't change their minds. She had seen it before, predators testing their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan pulled out a small ration pack, tossing one toward her.
Eat.
She caught it without thinking. I'm fine. You're not, he countered. Neither am I. But if we're going to keep moving, we need energy. He wasn't wrong. Zyra unsealed the pack, taking a careful bite of the dense, nutrient-heavy bar. It was flavorless but efficient. She swallowed, her body grateful for the fuel even as her mind remained sharp, focused. Ethan leaned back against the stone. If they wanted to attack, they would have done it already. Zyra nodded. They're waiting for something, or someone. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Zyra considered the possibility. The creatures weren't acting like mindless beasts. They were organized, tactical, which meant there was a purpose behind their restraint. Ethan sighed. We'll take turns keeping watch.
Get some rest.
Zyra hesitated. Sleep felt like a risk she couldn't afford. But logic dictated otherwise. If she exhausted herself completely, she would be useless when the moment truly mattered. She nodded once. Wake me if anything changes. Ethan gave her a small, knowing smirk. Trust me, I'm not that reckless. She allowed herself a ghost of a smile in return. Then, with the cold creeping into her skin and the darkness pressing in around them, she closed her eyes and listened. Zyra woke to the sound of the wind shifting, a subtle but distinct change in the air. The temperature had dropped further, the chill biting through her clothing despite the insulation. For a moment, she remained still, her senses adjusting to the darkness, to the silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. The plateau stretched out around them, bathed in faint starlight, and Ethan sat a few feet away, his silhouette rigid against the night. She pushed herself up slowly. Anything? Ethan shook his head, though his eyes remained fixed on the valley below. Nothing visible, but I don't like it. Neither did she. The creatures had been there earlier, watching, tracking. And now, nothing. Absence was not the same as safety. It was movement in another form. She stepped beside him, scanning the landscape. The wind carried the scent of dust and minerals, dry and sharp. There was no sound beyond the occasional gust, no telltale clicking from the creatures that had shadowed them before. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Ethan shifted, rubbing a hand over his jaw. They're waiting. Zyra considered the thought. For what? Ethan exhaled. A reason. She understood. Everything about these beings suggested intelligence, a calculated approach. If they had chosen not to attack, it wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. Which meant the moment of action hadn't arrived yet. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon. The outpost was still too far. Reaching it was their best option, but she had no illusions about what that journey would entail. They were already being hunted. They just didn't know the rules of the game yet. Ethan shifted his weight. We leave at first light. Zyra nodded. They had no other choice. Staying put wouldn't keep them safe, only delay the inevitable. Ethan tossed a small object her way, and she caught it automatically. A heat capsule. She activated it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers before tucking it into her clothing. The cold had settled deep into her bones, and while she had adapted to the extremes of this world, she had not conquered them. Ethan leaned back against the rock, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You slept lighter than I expected." She met his gaze. "I always do." A short, knowing nod. Neither of them trusted the quiet. Hours passed in slow stretches, the night pressing down on them like a living thing. Zyra remained alert, muscles coiled, senses reaching beyond what her eyes could see. She had spent her life navigating structured, sterile environments where unpredictability had been a rare and unwelcome variable. Here it was the only constant. As the first traces of dawn brushed the sky in muted gold, Ethan stood. Time to move. Zyra rose without hesitation. Their packs were light, but every ounce of weight carried significance. She secured her gear, checking the placement of her weapon, the balance of her supplies. Preparation was survival. They descended from the plateau in careful strides, the rock beneath their boots shifting but holding firm. The valley below stretched vast and empty, though they both knew better than to believe it was unoccupied. Zyra kept her breath even as they moved, each step measured, deliberate. The stillness of the land gnawed at the edges of her awareness, setting her nerves on edge. Then, just as the sun crested the horizon, the silence broke. A single, sharp click. Zyra froze. Ethan did too. Then another. And another. The sound came from all around them, layered in echoes, bouncing off unseen surfaces. Not random. Coordinated. Ethan's hand moved toward his weapon. "Stay close." Zyra didn't need to be told twice. The clicking intensified, the pattern shifting. Then, at last, movement. Shadows peeling from the rocks, emerging from the dust like specters of the land itself. Not just a few. Dozens. Zyra inhaled slowly, keeping her stance firm. The creatures did not rush them. They surrounded instead, forming a perimeter, a silent enclosure. A trap. Ethan's fingers tightened around his weapon, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Zyra's pulse remained steady. The creatures had chosen this moment, which meant they had something to say. She lifted her chin, locking eyes with the nearest one. Waiting. The clicking slowed. Then a shift. A single creature stepped forward, larger than the others, its body gleaming dark and sharp in the morning light. Ethan murmured just loud enough for her to hear.
"Well,
that's new." Zyra remained still, unflinching. The creature studied her, its head tilting in that same eerie way she had seen before. Then finally, it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in movement. A deliberate step forward. A pause. Then another. An invitation. Zyra exhaled. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a conversation. And now they had to decide how to respond.